For 3 years of marriage, she never got to shower by herself. Not once. Not even in the dead of winter, standing there, shivering, waiting for her turn under the water. He called it his love language. He said it made him feel close to her. That wasn't what it was. And the night everything finally cracked wasn't even about the shower. It was a Tuesday. She was crying. He'd just hurt her, really hurt her. And instead of comforting her, instead of even asking if she was okay, he reached over, took her hand, and put it exactly where he wanted it. When she pulled away, he laughed. "You escaped," he said, like it was a game. This is the story of a woman who spent years convincing herself that what was happening to her had another name. Anything but the real one. Her name isn't given in the original post, so for the sake of this story, we'll call her Claire. Her husband, we'll call Daniel. Claire was 30. Daniel was 35. They'd been married 3 years, together longer than that, and by most outward appearances, they were a normal couple. Not perfect, but normal. Daniel had always been the affectionate type, careful with her, attentive, the kind of husband who noticed when something was wrong before she said a word. Then, at the start of the year, Daniel's father died. Grief does strange things to people. Claire knew that going in. She braced herself for a Daniel who might withdraw, or cry more, or need extra patience for a while. What she didn't expect was for the man she loved to become someone she barely recognized. They moved in with Daniel's mother for about 6 weeks after the funeral, helping with the arrangements, the paperwork, all the small, brutal logistics that come after someone dies, and just being there for her emotionally. It seemed like the right thing to do. A grieving widow shouldn't be alone. But when Claire and Daniel finally came home, packed up their things, and walked back through their own front door, something in Daniel had changed. And it didn't change back. At first, it was small, almost easy to dismiss. Claire loved birds. In their backyard, she'd whistle softly, coaxing them closer, watching them hop along the fence line while she sipped her coffee. It was one of those small, quiet joys, the kind of thing that made an ordinary morning feel a little more alive. One day, Daniel watched her do it and said, flatly, "Stop whistling at them. They're going to want to fuck you." Claire laughed it off. Awkward joke, she told herself. Grief, humor. People say weird things when they're hurting. Then it happened again. She was organizing the pantry, unpacking groceries, and set a few cucumbers on the counter. Daniel picked one up, turned it over in his hand, and asked her, with a completely straight face, if she bought them to use on herself. She didn't laugh that time. She just felt her stomach drop a little and told herself it was still just Daniel being Daniel. Grief. It's grief. He'll come back to himself. But it kept happening. If they were out and a woman complimented Claire's hair or told her she liked her outfit, Daniel would spend the rest of the day calling that stranger her girlfriend, making pointed comments about how apparently every woman they met wanted to sleep with his wife. At first, it almost sounded like jealousy turned inside out, like he was trying to make a joke of something that unsettled him. But it never felt like a joke to Claire. It felt like something colder, something aimed at her. She brought up therapy, gently, more than once. Daniel always had the same answer. He didn't need it. He knew he needed to change, and he'd do it on his own. What confused Claire most wasn't the comments themselves. It was the contrast. Daniel could hang up the phone with his mother, voice still warm from comforting her, from listening to her grief with the kind of patience Claire used to admire in him, and turn to Claire seconds later with something sharp and cold in his eyes, like a switch flipping, like there were 2 different men living in the same house, and only one of them ever got to see the good one. She kept asking herself the same question, over and over, lying awake at night. Why is he so angry at me? She didn't have an answer yet, but her body, she'd later realize, already knew something her mind wasn't ready to accept. It was an ordinary night. Nothing about it felt different going in. Daniel initiated sex, and Claire, as she almost always did, didn't feel like she had room to say no. It wasn't that he'd ever threatened her. It was smaller and more insidious than that. If she hesitated, he'd get upset. He'd tell her he felt unwanted, rejected, like something was wrong with their marriage because of her. And then the guilt would arrive right on schedule, heavier than whatever discomfort she'd started with. So she went along with it, like she usually did. But almost immediately, something felt wrong. Daniel had always been gentle with her, careful, present. That night, none of that was there. When she looked up at his face, she didn't see love or even lust. She saw something closer to anger, maybe even something like hatred, though she didn't want to let herself think the word. His movements were rough, rougher than anything she'd experienced with him before, and it started to hurt, really hurt. She was scared to say anything, scared of how he'd react, scared of turning this into a fight, scared in a way she didn't fully understand yet. Eventually, the pain won out over the fear. She pushed him off her. "I'm hurt," she said, carefully, deliberately, phrasing it that exact way so it wouldn't sound like an accusation, so it wouldn't sound like blame. Then she started to cry. And this is the moment. This is the moment the story turns. While she lay there crying, Daniel reached over, took her hand, and placed it on himself. He wanted her to finish what they'd started, not comfort her, not check if she was okay, just finish. In that instant, something inside Claire went very quiet and very cold. "I was literally crying in front of him," she would write later, and that was what he was thinking about. She yanked her hand away. Daniel laughed. "You escaped," he said. She lay there and cried while he got up, showered, and went to bed. He never asked if she was okay. He never came back to check on her. Nothing. Claire would later say she had never in her life felt so disgusted or so reduced to an object by anyone, least of all the man she'd married. That night, something in her broke. And even as she lay there in the dark, she already knew, somewhere underneath the shock, there might not be any coming back from this. When Claire posted her story online, the response was immediate, and it was overwhelming. One commenter didn't soften anything. They told her plainly that what she'd described, in the clearest terms, was rape, that the fact it happened inside a marriage didn't change what it was. Another commenter zeroed in on the family dynamic, gently pointing out that Daniel's coldness toward his wife, paired with his warmth toward his mother, felt less like grief and more like a much older pattern, something that had probably existed long before his father ever died. A few people pushed back on the grief theory altogether. Grief, one person wrote, might explain someone withdrawing or snapping or crying more than usual. It does not explain cruelty. It does not explain being made to feel disgusting while you're crying in front of someone who's supposed to love you. Several commenters shared their own stories, women who'd lived through something similar, who recognized the exact shape of what Claire was describing before she'd even used the word for it herself. And more than one person asked the same quiet, pointed question. Had anyone in Daniel's family ever shown signs of blurred boundaries, the kind that might explain where this behavior had come from? Claire didn't have an answer yet, but that question would end up mattering more than anyone in the comments realized. Claire came back to update everyone, and the first thing she wanted to say was thank you. She said she'd never expected that much care from strangers on the internet, that the outpouring of support had moved her more than she could put into words. And then she said something that had clearly taken her a long time to admit, even to herself. She said her body had been telling her the truth for a long time, that some part of her had known, for longer than she wanted to admit, that what was happening to her had a name, a hard, ugly, specific name. She just hadn't been able to make herself believe that the man who was supposed to love and protect her could be the one doing it. But he had been. And, she realized as she kept writing, he had been doing it for a lot longer than one bad night. This is where the update peeled back the first layer Claire hadn't shared before. For the entire length of their marriage, she said, she had never once been allowed to shower alone. Not one single time. Not even in the winter, when she'd stand there shivering, waiting for her turn at the water, teeth practically chattering, while Daniel decided when they'd go in together. He called it his love language. He said sharing a shower made him feel connected to her. What it actually meant, Claire finally admitted, was that he expected her to perform oral sex on him every single time they showered together. Every time. Sometimes she'd skip showering altogether just to avoid the ordeal. Other times she'd rush through as fast as she physically could, trying to grab her towel and get out before he started what he called seducing her. And when she did, when she managed to slip out before it happened, he'd laugh. The same laugh, the same line. "Oh, you're escaping!" It wasn't a one-time joke born out of grief. It was a pattern that had been running underneath their entire marriage, disguised as intimacy, for years. Claire also went back to an incident that, at the time, she'd chalked up to just being weird, the kind of thing you shrug off and move past. One of Daniel's friends, also in his mid-30s, had a habit of making sexual jokes toward Daniel whenever the two of them hung out. Odd, Claire thought, but maybe that's just how they were with each other. Some friendships have their own strange rhythm. But one night, it went further. The friend sat pressed close beside Daniel, wouldn't stop touching him, and kept making increasingly explicit comments, the tone of all of it unmistakably suggestive, aimed squarely at Daniel. It got so uncomfortable that another friend in the group finally stepped in, telling the man to knock it off, to respect Claire, to respect the fact that Daniel was a married man. Daniel did nothing, said nothing, just sat there. Claire told him afterward how humiliated she'd felt, not just by the comments, but by the fact that a stranger had stepped in to defend their marriage when her own husband hadn't said a word. Daniel brushed it off, insisting his friend simply didn't understand boundaries. When Claire pointed out that the friend's comments had been aimed specifically at him and asked why that might be, Daniel just repeated himself. The next morning, Daniel's mother called Claire directly, not to check in on her, but to ask her to let it go, to not make a big deal out of it. The friend was just dumb, she said. He didn't know how to make jokes properly. Claire asked Daniel, plainly, if he wanted his mother handling this instead of him. And she asked him something else, too, gently, without trying to accuse him of anything, just trying to understand. Had he ever been involved with this friend, romantically or sexually? He denied it. Claire didn't push. She let it go, mostly. Daniel eventually asked the friend to stop, though even that conversation, she said, felt strange and stilted, like nobody involved really wanted to say out loud what everyone in the room already understood. The deeper Claire went into her update, the clearer a picture started to form, one that reached back long before she and Daniel had ever met. Daniel's mother, she explained, hadn't let him start school until he was 8 years old. She'd wanted him kept close to her, physically and otherwise, for as long as she could manage it. There were no locks on any door in that house. Not one. Not the bathroom, not anywhere. Every time Claire visited, she'd learned to barricade herself in with the hamper just to have a moment of actual privacy. When Claire wasn't around, Daniel's mother would walk through the house naked. If Daniel was showering there, she'd find any excuse she could to walk in, dismissing any discomfort with the same phrase every time. They weren't the kind of people who sexualized bodies. She asked Claire directly about her and Daniel's sex life. And Daniel, Claire discovered, told her, openly. When Claire said how deeply uncomfortable that made her, Daniel called her a prude, said it was normal, said there was nothing wrong with it. Claire began to realize that this, the not knowing what conversations were happening behind her back, the constant question of, will he tell his mother about this, was a huge part of why she'd stopped wanting any intimacy with her husband at all. It wasn't just what was happening between the two of them. It was the audience she never agreed to. "I think that's a huge part of me not wanting any intimacy with him," she wrote, "because I keep wondering, will he tell his mom about us doing this or that?" There was one more detail from Daniel's family that Claire brought up carefully, one she said she still couldn't fully make sense of and didn't want to overstate. Daniel's mother had a nephew, 11 years old at the time of the update. Whenever he visited, he slept in her bed, something Daniel's late father had voiced discomfort with more than once. She called the boy every single night to talk through dinner, again despite requests for quiet evenings alone with her husband. She brushed off every objection. When the boy was younger, Claire said, there had been a period where he touched her leg in a way that made her uncomfortable. She'd asked him to stop and raised it with Daniel, who explained it away. The boy was young and neurodivergent and didn't fully understand boundaries yet. It stopped on its own not long after. Claire didn't draw a hard conclusion from any of this. She said plainly she couldn't prove anything. But she admitted that somewhere along the way, she'd quietly decided she would never let that side of the family anywhere near children of her own. Not because of any one incident, but because of everything taken together. Before we go further into this update, if you've made it this far, hit that subscribe button. Stories like this one are exactly what this channel is built around, and it genuinely helps to have you along for the next one. Claire also finally addressed something she'd been asked about repeatedly in the comments, whether there'd been other women. There had been messages. Once, a video call and a text notification had popped up on Daniel's screen mid-conversation. A woman telling him she liked him so much with a heart attached. Claire asked who it was. He said a friend who lived overseas. When Claire pressed further, Daniel flipped it back on her, accused her of being insecure, said it hurt him that his love for her clearly wasn't enough to make her feel secure. A year later, he'd asked if this same woman could stay in their home over the holidays. When Claire said no, he was furious. Another woman had sent him an explicitly sexual message. Daniel told her about that one himself, framing it as proof of his honesty, explaining that he'd told the woman to stop now that he was married. What he left out at first, and only admitted later, was that he'd pursued her before, while she was in another relationship. His excuse, when confronted, was simple. But he hadn't been the one in a relationship at the time, as if that made it fine. He'd also make a habit of pointing out, constantly, whenever he thought a woman was checking him out, which, according to him, happened everywhere they went. Claire said she was fine with that part. She'd even laugh about it privately, because what he read as flirting, her instincts read as something closer to a stranger checking their pockets for a wallet. Then there was the night Claire tried, one last time, to plan something romantic. A real effort, a dinner, wine, candles, all of it at home, because Daniel hated going out. Mornings were too early and made him cranky. Afternoons had too much sun. Nights were too dark to drive. So home it was. As she reached for the wine bottle, Daniel snapped. "So you can only fuck me when you're drunk?" he shouted. The date ended before it began. That single sentence, more than almost anything else in the marriage, told Claire exactly how far apart they had drifted, and exactly how little of what was happening between them had anything to do with love. The morning after that fight, Daniel acted like nothing had happened. He was unusually sweet, which, by that point, unsettled Claire more than his coldness ever had. She'd learned by then that his kindness and his cruelty ran on a cycle she couldn't predict, so she stayed calm on the surface, giving nothing away while she quietly tried to figure out her next move. That night, he asked what was wrong. She told him how humiliated she'd felt, how used, how much like an object. He turned it around immediately, playing the victim, insisting he'd only reached for her hand that night to remind her she was still desirable, even while she was crying. That he'd meant it as encouragement, because things hadn't finished the way he'd wanted. When she asked why, if that was true, he'd simply left her crying alone to go shower and go to sleep, he shrugged, said he figured she was upset and needed space. Claire stopped arguing. She'd learned there was no point, that pushing back only looped them through the same cycle of him making her feelings her fault for hours until she gave up. So she just nodded until he stopped talking. Then, the next morning, Daniel told her he needed to move into his mother's house, indefinitely, that he needed to be there for her and for himself, that their home wasn't healthy for him anymore, that it was the only way for him to heal. Claire nodded, agreed, even though she knew that his mother's house was the least healthy place he could possibly go. But in that moment, she wasn't thinking about what was good for him anymore. For the first time in a long time, she let herself think about what was good for her. He packed a bag and left. The second his car pulled out of the driveway, Claire started crying, but this time out of something she almost didn't recognize anymore. Relief. Something close to joy. "It felt like the universe had opened a door for me," she would write, "one that wasn't as dangerous as I thought it would have to be." She packed her own essentials that same day, booked a flight home to her parents, told him nothing. She wasn't going to give him the chance to change his mind, or check on her, or talk her out of it. From there, she said, she would start talking to lawyers about a divorce. One detail Claire saved for the very end of her update, almost like she needed to build up the courage to write it. Several commenters, trying to help her plan a safe exit, had asked if she had a brother, someone bigger, someone stronger than Daniel, who could come get her out. She did have a brother once. He died when she was 14. He was 20, and it was a terrible accident. Tall, strong, The kind of person people described as having a heart of gold, a gentle giant, the kind of older brother who would have torn the world apart to help her. Reading those comments, asking about a brother she'd lost 16 years earlier, Claire found herself crying all over again. Not out of grief this time, or not only grief. She said she believed, in some way she couldn't fully explain, that maybe he had been the one to move the pieces into place. That maybe some part of him had reached her the day Daniel finally walked out the door on his own. Claire's story is, in a lot of ways, about how long it can take to name something, even when your body already knows the truth. She spent years explaining away a pattern that, laid out end to end, was never really about grief at all. It was about control, about entitlement, about a family with no boundaries raising a son who never learned where his ended and someone else's began. What finally saved her wasn't a dramatic confrontation. It was quiet. He left on his own, thinking he was choosing his own healing, and in doing that, he handed her the exit she'd been too afraid to take herself. She's safe now. Rebuilding slowly, with people around her who actually see her. So here's the question we'll leave you with tonight. Have you ever looked back on something in your own life and only recognized it for what it really was after someone else said it out loud first? Let us know in the comments. We read every single one.